Yo, YouTube. International Master Danny Rensch here today for Chess.com. And in part one of our chess strategy series on how to use the little guys, I talked to you about the weaknesses, doubled pawns, isolated pawns, and backward pawns. And I promised you a quick review of some practical examples of how doubled pawns, isolated pawns, and backward pawns can be reached in real chess games. So here, one very common way that doubled pawns are reached is via one of the most popular openings in the history of chess, which is the Spanish. Now, the Spanish main lines with bishop a4 wouldn't necessarily reach doubled pawns, but often in the Spanish exchange, bishop takes c6, the Ruy Lopez exchange variation. After black captures back, we see double pawns immediately, right? Now, taking the pawn on e5 right away is not a good idea for white due to multiple reasons. Multiple ways for black to double attack and actually win back his material. But commonly, even though that trade isn't made, at some point what does happen is a trade of the d pawn for the e pawn. And in this type of position, we see that another weakness of having double pawns comes to light, and something that we will highlight more as we talk about the advantages you want to be able to recognize in terms of the pawns when you look at a chessboard, which is the ability to have a pass pawn and a majority which can lead to a pass pawn. Here white has a 4-on-3. And that's because this pawn left the d file and went over here. Black, of course, also has a 4-on-3, you may be saying, but black's pawn structure is not nearly as mobile or as effective because of the double pawns. So that's a quick example of how double pawns can backfire in a chess game. Now, here black has some other compensation for it, being the bishop pair and usually a quick way to develop the pieces. But if you were to take all the pieces off the board, which is that skill I talked to you about that every chess player needs, the ability to imagine the future of a position, you would see that in terms of just the pawn structure, the long-term factors, white has a serious advantage in this position and should actually be winning an endgame like this very easily, essentially playing up an extra pawn. Let's take a quick look at a very common way that an isolated queen pawn is reached. Through many different openings you can reach an IQP. But one of the most common is the Caro-Kann, and that being the Panov-Botvinnik variation after c4, knight f6, knight c3. At some point in this line, very commonly, a trade is made of the c pawn for the d pawn, either by black taking or by white taking. Here the theory is for white to capture here, and either queen c2 or bishop to d2 are both moves. And let's say a few more moves are made, we would actually see a very common example of what I was talking about in terms of the isolated pawn potentially offering good play. Here we see a position where, though the pawn itself unbiasedly is of course a weakness, white actually has good open space for the pieces. His pawn is slightly more further advanced than the pawn on e6, and the open files of the C and E nature will definitely favor white as well. So don't dismiss isolated queen pawn positions as one that you just don't want to play. They're very dynamic and lots of fun, and leave lots of room to outplay your opponent if you're a stronger player, whether you're playing against the weakness or for the weakness. So there's a quick example of an opening that could reach an isolated queen pawn. That exact same type of position is reached commonly through Queen's Indian move orders like this, where after c5, white plays e3, and after take, you see we've actually made a transposition, which is where you reach the same position in an early middle game or opening through a different move order. That's what that word means there. Let's see one more example of backward pawns here before we wrap this thing up and ship it to Santa Claus. One of the most common and popular ways that a backward pawn is almost welcomed by one player is in the open Sicilians, the Sveshnikov variation, where black will often strike at the center early with the move e5. In this position, black is being extremely aggressive in terms of the pressure he's exerting, but positionally, just in terms of the pawns, we see that a situation like this has a weak pawn on d6 that cannot move forward due to capture, and again, by definition, he's a backward pawn because his brother pawns have left him behind. He's backward. Now, it's not the true definition of a backward pawn in the one I showed you in the first example, where you can't advance either due to regular capture or en passant. That would take a white pawn being on, let's say, the 5th rank holding it back. But the concept that the pawn is stuck and that his brother pawns have left him behind, he cannot advance due to capture, is the same thing. And in this case, white has positional weaknesses to try to take advantage of. Usually a weakness is associated with a backward pawn is what's called an outpost square, which is a square that can no longer be attacked by pawns, once again by definition because the pawns have left. A quick and perhaps slightly more advanced example for a backward pawn would be positions like this, commonly reached out of a Maroczy bind in an accelerated dragon or other types of English openings. Often the Marco hop is employed when white has a space advantage, which is putting this knight into d5, and after the bishop captures, not wanting to leave that pony on a dominant square, right? No one likes that. It's not a pony party. White captures back with the e-pawn, and this e-file is now hitting the backward pawn. Now, it doesn't seem so obvious right away. That's why I said this is an advanced example, because there are pieces in the way. But at some point, this pawn on e7 is a positional weakness, and it is a backward pawn that cannot advance once due to capture or twice due to en passant capture. Now, in this case, this pawn is technically protecting this square, so advancing and allowing capture is a possibility for black. But a weakness is always created at the end of that capture, which is a weak pawn on d6 on the newly minted open file. So this positional idea of popping the knight into d5 is a very common one for white, and it's a very clear example of the potential weaknesses of a backward pawn. Hope you guys are enjoying these videos. Again, remember, if you're loving the live sessions and Bullet Brawl Chess Thursdays, you can follow me on Twitter at Daniel Rensch, and we will see you around on Chess.com. Hope you enjoyed this video, and we'll see you around on Chess.com.